So if you are here for writing how it works, get your team on the same page, then you're in the right place. Before we get started, I'd like to just extend a very, very warm welcome and thank you to everyone who's attending. It's so awesome to have people from around the world to join us. If you don't know, we're SDXD, it stands for San Diego Experience Design Professionals Network, and we're a group of UX professionals who meet regularly for education, inspiration, and connection. So we hope you get all three of those things tonight. I'm James, and I'm the president of SDXD, and I'd also like to say thank you to my organizing board and our advisory board who helps make sure that these events happen every month. And next off, I'd like to hand it off to Hannah, experience designer at our sponsor, Tiled, to talk more.
Hey guys, thank you. We can go ahead and go to our next slide, James. So yeah, so like James said, I'm from Tiled, and so Tiled is a micro app platform. We're based locally in San Diego, so it's fun to be working with SDXD. And we describe ourselves as the easiest way to create interactive experiences with complete creative flexibility that you can share across channels. So what that means is that brands can build, share, and measure interactive content without using any code. That's important. And that they can embed rich media in them to make them a really immersive experience. So we like to think of them as more than, say, a presentation or a pitch deck, and also more than a prototype, and that for whatever kind of content you're creating that might otherwise be, not really something experiential, that might just be flat and linear, you can make it something that's really going to have those exploratory qualities of something more like an app or website that'll be a lot more immersive for your users to engage with. Next slide. Thank you. So yeah, a few things to note. We're design tool agnostic. So that means that you can design in whatever kind of tool you normally use to design in. So if you use XD, Sketch, Figma, any of that, you can. You can even use more traditional design tools like Illustrator or InDesign, or we even get non-designers making their own micro apps and things like PowerPoint and Google Slides, which is really cool to see. And then you can just sync your assets or import them into Tiled. If you use XD or Sketch, we have plugins to make syncing to that, or syncing from them, really easy. And then from Tiled, you can add all your interactive elements and then share your micro apps. So we have a lot of different ways you can share. You can share by embedding, or by sending them directly to people, by posting them on social media, things like that. And then you get insights from your user pathways. You can see where they're clicking on your screen, what they're most interested in, so that you can both improve your content and figure out what's useful to your users. So we try to make kind of all the features you get from interactive media, like I said, apps and websites, something that's available for what's traditionally more static media. Next slide. So as far as who uses Tiled, most of our customers are enterprise. We do offer a free account for designers to go ahead and get started building micro apps. So you can all go to tiled.co and claim one there. We would love to see you guys start building things. And like I said, we typically see them for all kinds of communication purposes. So we like to think that really anything that is a PDF now could become a micro app, a PDF or PowerPoint or anything like that, I should say. So we see a lot of really exciting things with pitch decks coming up. We see companies doing really creative things around employee onboarding, and especially now that we're all quarantined with coronavirus, we see a lot of things like, digital events and employee just experience things that bring people together through these experiences. So that's cool. We see a lot of marketing use cases, a lot of kind of customer training and education. We even embed micro apps ourselves to do things like product education. So we just try to make them something that's going to be really easy for designers to create and iterate on, for whatever kind of use case they want, something that's going to be immersive and they want it to be easy to create. So that's it from us. Like I said, we're Tiled. The website is tiled.co if you want to learn more to check it out. And we're happy to be here. We love working with designers. So thanks, James.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah and Tiled, for sponsoring such a cool tool that brings a different level of interactivity, design, and polish to your needs without code or a lot of time and effort required. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Shosh Cates from Tiled, as well as Betty Lau for being awesome, awesome partners with us. So we have a few upcoming events that I'd like to share. So this is hot off the electronic presses. If you go to our meetup page, you'll see a new 2-day micro conference, which we're calling UX Methods in Action. So we're going to cover some foundational design thinking methodologies, techniques, and exercises, and go over them and answer your questions about them. On September 23rd, we'll be welcoming Paige Bennett, Design Research Manager at Dropbox's growth team, to talk about bringing research findings to life. And she'll discuss tools, techniques, methodologies, regardless of your team size and budget, to make sure that your research findings really stick in the hearts and minds of all your stakeholders. But back to tonight, our agenda is to have a 1-hour presentation by Brian. Then we'll do Q&A, followed by an optional networking, which will take place in Zoom breakout rooms. So just friendly reminders, please don't be shy. We'd love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback in the chat. And Brian, AKA BIM, will answer them along the way. So we're about to delve into it, almost there. I'm just gonna share a little bit about BIM, and then we will hand off the stage. So BIM works at ServiceNow as their principal product manager on flow automation products. Previously, he co-founded Arthur, an agency that specializes in design strategy and UX for SaaS products. BIM and his wife recently had their first daughter, and whenever he's not spending time with his daughter, he's always looking for new challenges. Currently, those include beach volleyball, new languages, and improving at chess. He's also a spreadsheet wizard, and I'm not kidding you, built out a Mad Lib meets choose your own adventure product in spreadsheets to create short, unique children's stories. Just an awesome, awesome individual. I love the way his brain works and how creative he is. So without further ado, let's give a warm SDXD welcome to BIM in his presentation. Show him love in the chat by saying, hi, BIM, welcome, BIM. All that good stuff.
I'm sharing full screen now, so I can't see the chat, but I'll trust James to let me know if anything important comes up. I can only assume it's just like applause emojis, you know, all up and down the chat right now.
I wish we could have a counter for how many exclamation points are in the chat right now. Just unreal.
Well, thank you for the warm intro, James. I've known James for a couple of years now, mostly through these SDXD events, and you know, I'm always willing to help out, and I learn a lot from him, and for whatever reason, it keeps inviting me back. So I love giving presentations like these. Today, as James mentioned, we are going to learn writing how it works. It's a pretty top level statement. You know, it doesn't really tell you a whole bunch. But really what we're going to focus on is how to write how your interaction works within your application or your product. But you know, before we get into that, James mentioned a little bit about me. This is me and my wife Hannah and my daughter Sable, looking kind of surprised at what's going on. But she was born in January, so pretty close to the quarantine. But during quarantine, I picked up a couple habits. First of which is learning how to bake, much like a lot of other people on Instagram. But instead of like sourdough bread, I wanted a different challenge. So I, of course, went to strawberry hand pies. I went to the Carlsbad farms around here, picked some strawberries, and then tried to make some hand pies, which are really just calzones with fruit filling. But some of them turned out great and some of them didn't. As James mentioned, I'm also really trying to improve at chess this year. You know, I had a goal to get to a certain level, and then you can see on my chart right here, really once the quarantine kicked in, I had a little bit more time to play. So I actually got a lot better at chess once the stay-at-home orders were issued. And then finally, while I'm staying at home and working from home, I get to spend a lot more time with my daughter, Sable. So this is actually a picture of the first time she stepped foot in the Pacific, and you can kind of see that look on her face where she doesn't really know what to make of the situation at that point. But it's been fun to actually be able to work from home and spend a lot of time with her as, you know, she's going through her early years, or her early months rather. But that's a little bit about me. Let's, you know what, let's kick things off with an activity today. Everything that we are going to be doing today is all about learning how to describe our interactions and how our apps or our websites actually work. And today we're going to use one particular website as kind of the through line for our entire workshop. And it is this website called textmoji.app. And the high level functionality is, you know, a lot of people use Slack right now, and emojis are kind of fun. And the singular purpose of this website is to allow you to enter some text and customize some options and make your own emojis. And I thought it was pretty fun and had some interesting complexity for something that seemed so simple. So this is what we're going to be working with today. Now, what I want us to do for our first activity is to go to the website textmoji.app, and James is going to drop the link into the chat as well. And very specifically, you know, you can play around with it for, you know, a minute or two, but I want you to pay particular attention to how borders work on the emojis. There are a couple different options there, a couple different colors, shapes, things like that. Let's focus on playing around with borders, and then whether it is on a sheet of paper or in the chat or in wherever you want to type some text, I want you to do your best and tell me how borders work. This is going to be a little bit of an open-ended challenge, and James is going to play some music for us, and we'll go for probably about 3 or 4 minutes just to see where you get. There's no right or wrong answer right now, but we'll build on this throughout the workshop. All right, so green slides are normally going to indicate there's some sort of activity that you're doing, and blue slides in this presentation will indicate some sort of reflection or discussion. So one of the things I want you to think about, because we will be coming back to this particular example, is what was it like to have to describe something in text? Was it easier, more difficult than you expected? Were there any challenges? Feel free to drop in any answers to those questions into the chat as well, and James will let me know if there's something to discuss. But it turns out that writing how things work can be difficult, right? But in design, there are a lot of frameworks that help us with writing. And today we're going to talk about the core problem we're trying to solve, a good framework that we can use to help us in describing how things work, and some pro tips on that, how to really tighten up our framework so you can have great scenarios written. So first off, for our problem, this is a design call, right? A design meetup. A lot of people are familiar with the items on this screen, you know, user stories, or, you know, as a user, I want to do something so that I can have some benefit, or a job story. When some scenario is occurring, I want to do something so that I can have some benefit. How might we statements, you know, they're crafted in a very particular way to have a problem, but not a prescriptive solution. Even if you Google problem statement, there are all sorts of different frameworks and ways that, you know, you can methodically put together a problem statement. Even something like 5 whys is an early stage activity where you put in writing the problems that you're trying to solve that are very abstracted. All of these are really, really useful ways to align teams on a written artifact at the beginning of the design process. You're trying to align everybody on the problem that you're trying to solve, which is super valuable. But as we progress through the design process, once we identify and agree on this collection of words that describes our problem, we start to sketch. We start to create some wireframes, some prototypes. We get into visual design. We do some testing with users. And along that way, there's few frameworks that I've seen that actually have a similar purpose to defining your problem, but for defining your solution. So this is a problem that I've come up with, or this is a problem that I've identified with as I've moved through UX roles into strategy roles and into product manager roles, is writing how our solutions to our very well crafted problems, like how do we write that in a clear and succinct way? And it's something I've had a lot of trouble with at where I'm at now as a product manager, but also in past roles at agencies or in-house jobs. And I think it's for a couple reasons. And one, writing is thinking. To be able to write clearly, you have to know exactly what you want to say. There's no filler words like or like that buy you some time to connect your thoughts together. Once you put something down on paper, you can edit it and you can craft it, but it takes a lot of mental work to figure out exactly what you want to say to make sure that it will resonate with the right people. When we're trying to describe how solutions work, we need to make sure, as designers, we need to make sure that our solution descriptions connect with stakeholders, with people on the research team, with our end users, with designers on another team who might be working on something similar, and most importantly, with our developers who are actually going to be building how these things work. And because writing takes so much thinking to figure out the right way to describe stuff, writing is actually very hard to do. It's hard to do it well. We want to try and make our writing as clear and unambiguous as possible, because we've all been a part of those Slack messages where James says one thing, I interpret it a specific way, but then Betty interprets it a totally different way. And even though we all saw James's words, we all interpret them a little bit differently. So it turns out it's really, really difficult to write something in a clear way that everyone understands the exact same way. Now, because it takes a lot of thinking to do this, and because it is hard to write your solutions well, it takes a lot of practice. If you've ever learned how to write user stories or job stories, the syntax of, as a user, I want to do something so that I can benefit. The first time you're writing those, they feel a little bit weird. You feel constrained by these arbitrary rules that tell you what to do. But once you get the hang of it, writing a user story comes second nature, and it's very helpful for you in the beginning of a project. Today, the framework that we're introducing will help you to think about how to write your solutions. It'll show you that writing these solutions isn't as hard as we may have seen, and we're actually going to get a lot of practice writing our solution statements. So let's get into our framework for how we're going to write how things work today. It is called Gherkin Scenarios, and it's kind of a weird name. I realize that. And when I discovered them, admittedly, I Googled a lot to make sure that, yes, this is actually the true name of this framework. But it turns out Gherkin is a type of syntax or format that a company called Cucumber, another kind of bizarrely named company, came out with a while ago to help with behavior-driven development. So Cucumber was a company that, well, they developed a lot. And what they wanted to do was to create some sort of automated process where business stakeholders or people that were not on the development team could write their expected behavior for how a user progressed through an application. For example, if a user is on a login page, every time they click on the login button, if their credentials are correct, then they advance to the dashboard. Cucumber wanted to come up with a very specific framework so the business users could kind of tell the application how to verify if things were behaving correctly. The framework that they came up with is Gherkin. When it boils down to it, it's really just a framework for describing how specific interactions work. If there's one thing you take away from this presentation, it's this slide, but really it's actually probably this slide right here. Similar to a user story or a job story, there are only a couple of core parts of a Gherkin scenario. First is the scenario. Then we use the given prompt, a when prompt, and a then prompt. It's pretty straightforward, but these 4 prompts will really help you to articulate how certain pieces of functionality in your app work and what's supposed to turn on, what's supposed to turn off. Let's start with the scenario then. At the highest level, this is the 1-sentence description of the interaction that you're describing. With Gherkin scenarios, we really want to zoom in on one particular piece of functionality so we can describe it with really accurate detail. For our Textmoji app, we're going to use this example of something that's really basic, like viewing the how to add to Slack modal. We can see when we're on this screen, there's a lot of stuff on here, and there's a link that says how to add to Slack. When we click on that, a big screen pops up, has a close button, all sorts of things. Oh, side note, James mentioned earlier that I'm learning a couple languages. If you can drop into the chat what language this is, you'll get some bonus points when we do Q&A at the end. All right, so we have our Textmoji app for just viewing how to add to Slack. So let's look at what our scenario might be. Our scenario at the top level is view the add to Slack modal. This is going to be a very basic example, but I promise you we'll build on top of it. This is a single sentence that describes the functionality that we're solving for. Next, we'll get into given. Given describes the set of circumstances that are in place for the scenario to happen. So any necessary background or context or where a user needs to be for this scenario to actually occur. In this example, our scenario, view the add to Slack modal, our background or our given is pretty simple. Given the user is on textmoji.app. It's pretty simple in this case because textmoji.app is a single page website. There aren't any other pages. But if you're doing something more complicated, or even, for example, logging into a website, you might want to specify that given the user is on the login page and they have entered their email and their password is correct. So we can add more context to the scenario that we're trying to solve to help describe our solution better. And then we'll get into when. When is the action performed by the user or the system that causes something else to happen. Another word you might hear for this is the trigger. So what is the thing that kicks off the next series of events? In our example, for the view to add to Slack modal, given the user is on textmoji.app, when the user clicks on how to add to Slack. The user clicking on that link is kind of the trigger that will determine what happens next. Finally, we have then. Simply put, it's what happens after when happens. There wasn't an easier way to describe it, and I realize this looks a little circular. But in our scenario, the view to add to Slack modal, given the user is on textmoji.app, when the user clicks how to add to Slack, then the system opens the add to Slack modal. This is pretty compact, and I know you might be thinking, wow, do I need to write all of this just for a link? Well, we'll get into some more complex examples later on, but what I like about this example is it's illustrative of the solution that we're trying to solve for, trying to view and add to Slack modal, tells you exactly where the user is once this scenario kicks off, exactly what that user does, and exactly what happens next. And perhaps if you're a business user or you're on a design team and you're not prototyping, this can be a really easy way to communicate expected interactions. Now here's a more complicated example from textmoji.app, and it's just updating the text color of an emoji. And this is an example of where we can be much more specific with how stuff works. Given the user is on textmoji.app and the user selected a template, when the user selects a new font color, then the system updates the emoji font color, but the system does not update the emoji shape, and the system does not update the border color, and the system does not update the font style. What I like about this example is it very clearly says what is happening when you select a new font color and very explicitly describing what is not happening. I found that when writing Gherkin scenarios to facilitate designer and developer handoff, defining what doesn't happen, but someone might assume happens, is actually really valuable and gets the team aligned much more quickly. So we learned this framework right now. We have a scenario, we have our given statement that provides some background, we have our when statement that defines a trigger, and we have our then statement that describes what happens after when. We have a quick activity, probably about 10 minutes, where you're gonna get to practice this on textmoji.app using a couple guided examples. James is going to be pasting some links into the chat, one of which will copy the Google Doc of the worksheet for you. And if you have a Google account, you'll be able to edit within there. And then if you don't have a Google account, the other doc will be a link to download a Word doc of the exact same worksheet. Some of these examples within the worksheet will give you the scenario and the given and the when, but not the then. Others will give you just the scenario and you fill out the rest. It's kind of like a training wheels exercise before we get to the final activity where you set out on your own. James, do you already send out the links?
Yes, they are
Cool.
in the chat.
Great. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop screen sharing. James is going to resume playing those awesome tunes that he was playing earlier. And we'll set a timer for 10 minutes to let you kind of work through these different activities. And I'll be available on the chat if you have any questions or you're getting hung up on a particular scenario. Hey, Justin, who just posted, really nice work. Yeah, so if you look in the chat, there are a lot of people that are along very similar lines, and everyone is conceptually getting where we're going. One of the things I've learned with writing Gherkin stories is the amount of detail that you need to put into them can be dependent on how close the other people working on the project are. You're sitting next to your developer and you'll be working very closely with them. Sometimes you can use a little bit less detail. For example, I see a lot of people say, given the user is on the Textmoji app, when the user clicks on a theme and that theme is selected, then the selected theme is displayed, or the selected theme is applied, or something to that effect. And that generally will work if everybody on your team, stakeholders, customers, documentation team, developers, PMs, whatever, are all familiar with what constitutes a theme. Justin Cox in the chat did a good job of mentioning all the specific parts that constitute a theme that get changed when you select it, including font style, font color, background shape, background color, border style, everything. Again, if you're working closely with your team, you might not need that much detail. But sometimes if you're working with a remote dev shop, or maybe everybody's remotely distributed because of some global pandemic that's happening, defaulting to more detail can be really valuable. So now's an opportunity where if you're in the chat, you can drop in how you felt that went. Was the structure restrictive or too open-ended? Did you have any difficulty figuring out what the right level of detail was? Well, if you had a little bit of trouble here, keep in mind we've done one activity so far that was really open-ended, describing how borders worked with no framework or no tips or anything like that. And then we just provided a framework. So we're getting a little bit more practice with conceptually how we want to describe our solutions. If you felt a little bit of conflict or mashing of gears while you were writing these stories, don't worry. I have some pro tips for you to help you out. And those tips are to be timely, be active, and be direct. And be timely. When we were doing a run through of this presentation a couple weeks ago, I thought it was smooth sailing. I was going through with no problems. And then Betty came out of nowhere and asked me a real tough question. And it was, this is all great, but when should people actually be using these Gherkin stories? And admittedly, I'd never really thought about that answer before, just because I've always kind of just applied them where necessary. But it turns out there are really good times to use them and times where they're just simply not as helpful or valuable. And when you're in the problem definition phase, or when you're brainstorming ideas and what you're trying to do is come up with as many creative, different potential solutions as possible, it turns out that a framework for describing your interactions and solutions doesn't really help you all that much. But once you get into the later part of a project where you have come up with a solution, or you're handing off to a different team, or you're working with whoever if you're writing help articles for how your product works and need to meet with that team, detailing what is supposed to happen and when is really valuable. Another good example of when to not use Gherkin scenarios and when to use them. Gherkin scenarios describe how interactions work. If you're already in the middle of building a prototype and you're already in the process of determining which screens go where, sometimes it can just be more efficient to build this scenario into your prototype. But anyone who's built a prototype before knows that as soon as you share it to someone, you always get the feedback, well, what happens if I do this one thing? And your answer is always, well, I just don't have it in this prototype. And it happens to you all the time. And if your stakeholder or teammate is really pushy, then you have to go and redo your prototype and get that one flow in there. I found Gherkin scenarios actually to be really useful in this perspective, especially if you're using a tool like InVision or Figma, where you can leave comments on a design. Because then if your stakeholder or team member is asking how a bit of functionality works, you can just write a quick Gherkin scenario on that particular area where they have a question. And in my experience, sometimes that's enough to solve the issue. Next pro tip is to be active. And this isn't from like an exercising perspective, it's from a much nerdier angle, and that is the grammatical perspective. Having a when statement, like when the button is clicked, perhaps is descriptive. But when we use the active voice, where a noun does a verb to a noun, we're like this example, when the user clicks the upload button, we're very clearly indicating who or what is doing something to something else. In this example, we know it is the user who's doing the clicking, and they're clicking on the upload button specifically. It's a little bit of specificity that might seem like busy work, but believe me, once you write Gherkin scenarios and they get passed around and different people are reading them that you didn't expect, this specificity goes a long way. Additionally, if we say we have background context, given a document is uploaded, well, we could add some more specificity there and say, given the user uploaded a document to the system, we know who's doing it, what they're doing, and where that document is actually going. If you wanted to get more detailed, you could describe what the system is or the file path or whatever you want. The goal is to provide additional clarity for what is actually happening and removing ambiguity. And our last is to be direct. So this one really focuses on removing vague words like it, them, she, he, us, and challenging you to assign names or be more specific to what you're talking about. Maybe we're designing a password reset flow and we get to the end and it says, then it sends a message to them. Them might reference someone in the given or the when statement. But if we get more specific and we can say, then the system sends an email to Betty and James, we know that the system is doing it automatically. And it's not just any message. It's not a text message or, you know, a Slack DM or anything like that. We know that we're sending an email very specifically, and it's going to Betty and James. Or if there's a drop-down list, when she selects one of the choices. A way to clear that up is when the user selects an item in the city field. Now we're being more specific with the particular field that the user is selecting something from. So these are some quick pro tips. We're about to jump into our next activity where it's kind of totally freeform for you. But be timely, use Gherkin scenarios kind of during the solution phase and not the brainstorming phase. Be active, so use the active voice. So someone is always doing something to some other button or something in the system. And then the last one is to be direct. Replace all of our kind of vague references like it, them, or one of, or she, and challenge you to use things that are more specific, like the name of a persona or the user, or getting particular with the type of technology that's being used. So let's get into activity 3. Activity 3 is actually in your same worksheet. And now we're going to go back to the very first activity that we did today, describing how borders work. Now that we know this Gherkin scenario framework, and we can describe, you know, very particularly what our scenario is, what the background context is, what happens when you do something, and what the result is, and we know our pro tips for how to write better Gherkin scenarios, let's try and redo our very first exercise of the day and see if we've gotten any better. It is probable that there are a whole bunch of different scenarios that you can write for this. So the challenge is not to write just one, but to write as many as you feel are necessary to accurately describe how borders work. I challenge you to play around with different shapes and how different borders work on different shapes and how colors on borders work, things like that. So a lot of kind of interesting, simple but complex functionality that's all buried in there. James, I'll stop screen sharing. If you could play some music again, we'll go for probably about 7 or 8 minutes on this. And once you think you have good scenarios, feel free to drop them into the chat and I can provide feedback on them. All right. Yeah, these are pretty good. Tiffany, I like how when you click on the border width, the width is displayed as thick. Descriptive. Cool. Yeah, Justin coming in with his expected level of detail. So these are really good. At the end of the presentation, I'll have some contact info for me as well. So you know, if you didn't want to share your scenarios in the chat, but you are still looking for a little bit of feedback, if you want to implement this in your day-to-day or get better, I'll have my email and my Twitter account, so you can get in touch with me. All right. So yeah, so some of this border work was pretty interesting, right? Where this GIF is showing if I have a square emoji with the top and bottom border, once I click on the rounded rectangle, the top and bottom border style just doesn't exist anymore. From a raise of hands or just yes or no in the chat, how many people figured out or wrote a scenario regarding this particular interaction right here? We're clicking, if you're given the user is on a square emoji, when the user clicks on a rounded rectangle, then the top and bottom border element disappears. Anybody have that? I can't see the chat, so James, let me know. But this would be an example of how to write something like that, that is a little bit complex and is kind of hard to illustrate in a pretty complex prototype. This could be, given the user selected a square emoji and the user selected a top-bottom border style, when the user selects a rounded rectangle or circle, then the system applies the border style all, or encompassing, however you want to describe it, and the system hides the top-bottom style option. Because if you look at this, it's not only removing a border style when you click on the rounded rectangle, but it's actually updating the border style of your emoji automatically. So there are a couple things going on here that if you're handing off to a developer or if you're explaining to a stakeholder, this is, you know, contextual interactions that are valuable to demonstrate. So let's wrap it up real quick, and then we'll open this up for general Q&A. First off, we had this question: how do we write solutions? Writing problem statements and agreeing on the particular problem that we want to solve has been documented everywhere, in books, on the internet, in workshops, SDXD, UX Speakeasy, wherever. We spend a lot of energy, and very important energy, on defining our problem that we want to solve, but sometimes we just don't have those same frameworks for describing how our solutions actually work. Part of that is because it takes a lot of thinking to write clearly, and because it takes a lot of thinking, it's pretty hard to do. And as we've determined from today, writing well and clearly and unambiguously takes a lot of practice. And I actually saw a couple of you in the chat comment about how much you were learning how to do this between the 3 activities that we did today. Gherkin, again, it's a framework for describing how specific interactions work, and it's comprised of these 4 parts. The scenario, that is the 1-sentence explainer for what you're describing. Given contains all of our background context. When describes the trigger or the event that kicks off everything else. And then is what happens after when. And we have our 3 pro tips. Be timely. So use this during solution stages instead of brainstorming stages. Be active. So we always want to describe who or what is doing something to something else, whether it is the user clicks a button, whether the user clicks the login button, or it is then the system automatically sends an email to James. And then we want to be direct. So any of our vague references like it, them, he, she, let's replace those with terms like the user or the name of your persona or the particular item that someone is interacting with. And all that to be said, this is our final Gherkin scenario for the day. Given the user is presenting slides and the last slide is on the screen, when the user clicks to advance the presentation, then the presentation displays contact info and the presenter begins Q&A. That's all we had today for Gherkin scenarios. Hopefully you learned a little bit, had some fun, and maybe made some emojis that you can use in your Slack workspace as well. That's all I got.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bim. Let's show our love and appreciation of Bim in the chat right now, please. That was epic. So we do have one question from Chaden, and they're asking, is it always important to tell what doesn't happen in a Gherkin story?
Yeah, it's not always necessary to describe what doesn't happen. I mentioned earlier in the workshop, the amount of detail that you include into these scenarios really depends on how familiar the rest of your team is with what you're working on. If you have a remote team, or like perhaps you're contracting with a different company that might be doing actual development, or you just have an overseas team or something like that, adding in more detail about what happens and what doesn't happen, can really just reduce the opportunity for error or misinterpretation. But if you're working with a close pod of people, and you're at stand-up every day talking about how this particular piece of functionality is supposed to work, the level of detail you might need could be a little bit less.
Great. Our next question is from Kimberly in Malaysia, if I recall correctly. And she asks, at which point do we come across communicating versus providing actual value between design and developers?
Yeah, there's no fixed line here, but your team will tell you. if you're writing too much, or if you're describing very similar things but are just off by a little bit, and all of a sudden there's a wall of text, your team will generally let you know if you're writing too much, or if it could be communicated in a better way.
Right on. Yeah, that was the second part of the question, is just mentioning how there's a tendency from folks to feel deterred or steer away when there's too many words or over documentation. So great question and response. We have
real quick on that. It's actually one benefit of the Gherkin scenarios that I've found is sometimes if you're reading product documentation, or someone comes to you with a brief on how something is supposed to work, it can be really intimidating because it is a big document with a wall of text, and it's really wide and line breaks and all that. Gherkin scenarios are really good because they challenge you to do like one sentence or fragment at a time. So it actually, especially if you kind of space them out a little bit in a document, I find them to be a little bit less intimidating for team members to grasp, because it tends to just be like a smaller chunk. You tend to have more chunks, but each chunk is smaller and easier to digest.
Right, that standardization, familiarity, and then that mental model becomes very familiar.
Yeah, and especially if you bold the name of your scenario, people can scan pretty quickly to find what they're looking for.
Nice. Pro tip with the bolding. We have an anonymous attendee who's asking, could you please re-explain what be timely means within the Gherkin framework?
Yeah, in short, it just means use it at the right moment on a project. If you're going into a kickoff project and nothing has been decided yet, and you're really exploring opportunities or what is possible, a framework that helps to describe the end solution and interactivity is probably not really valuable at that time, because you haven't even figured out the problem or how you want to explore it yet.
Right on. We've got a great kind of design ops question from Lydia Hooper in the chat. And it's asking, if you need to write a Gherkin story for a lot of different interactions, that sounds from the outside like it's going to be a lot of writing. So how much time do you allow for yourself to create these?
Well, like we talked about a couple times in the presentation, like writing initially takes a lot of thinking. Initially, it's hard and takes a lot of practice. But I found that once you get into the rhythm of writing these, it just kind of flows. Once you figure out, okay, I'm always going to say when the user clicks on this thing, and you kind of get your core phrases to describe stuff. However, in your worksheet, at the very bottom, there's a section called Additional Resources, and it talks about how you can group some of your Gherkin scenarios together within like a larger feature, where you can define like a lot of background that might be shared across several Gherkin scenarios. But you can just define all the background in one spot, and that way your given statements for each small piece of functionality can be really lean. I actually pasted an example into that worksheet. So it's talking specifically about login, whether you're trying to describe successful login, unsuccessful, someone has two-factor authentication, someone has SSO. All of those are realistic scenarios for a login screen. But we can kind of toss a bunch of the normal context saying they're on the user or they're on the login screen and they have the correct email address. We can get those out of the way ahead of time by adding a larger background section.
Right on. And as a follow-up to that, would love to hear about the cross functional interaction and collaboration? For example, do you share with developers and teammates as you're writing them? Is there a meeting?
Yeah, I would say, especially since everybody at ServiceNow is currently remote, a lot of our interactions and statuses and progress check-ins are text-based. You know, it's communicating via Slack or email on how something is supposed to work. Not everybody's online at the same time. People are distributed. Someone might be trying to provide feedback while they're on another call. I've really found this framework has been useful to get team members quickly agreeing on how something is supposed to work, whether it's me working with our technical writers or designers or our developers. Sometimes a quick DM with a concise, well-defined Gherkin story can save us a 30-minute Zoom call somewhere later that day.
Right on. That's just a great return on effort there.
Yeah.
Mara's asking, any tips for writing great AC acceptance criteria?
Yeah, I use a lot of Gherkin stories. Really, you know, acceptance criteria can be a couple different things. You know, you can describe how something is supposed to work from a functional perspective, from a usability or reliability or performance perspective, and those are all different ways where we can define acceptance criteria for development teams. But I find for usability specifically, Gherkin stories have been really effective for me and the teams that I work with on making sure the screens and the interactions are correctly put together.
Excellent. We just got a question from Topher, and he's asking, are screenshots ever provided to accompany these stories for those who like some visual medium?
Yeah, a lot of times supplying images or anything visual can go a long way. Recently, I had a scenario where there was some pretty complex functionality where we had, you know, 2 side panels in our system, and whether one collapsed, the other one might not have, or there was weird and complex behavior with how these 2 side-by-side panels interacted with each other. And I started writing out a bunch of Gherkin scenarios, and I realized that there was a lot going on. So I also put together just like a quick PowerPoint prototype, you know, with some basic animations and just rectangles moving around, how it works. So yeah, sure, visuals can absolutely aid and assist. I mean, the ultimate goal of Gherkin scenarios is to get clear communication between members of your team. I would never say that this is the only way to do it, but it is certainly a tool or a method that is available to you to help your team get on the same page.
Right on. Fantastic. That is it for the questions that I see here in chat and in Q&A. For any brave souls who still have things that are uncertain, I'll actually invite you. You can raise your hand and we can unmute you. You can actually speak directly with them, or feel free to throw it in text in the chat or the Q&A feature.
Oh, hold on, I also wanted to give a shout out to a couple people that correctly guessed that the language I was using was Esperanto. So congrats to Stephen Frost, Diego Fontes, Adela, and there are a couple others in there. Yeah, I'm kind of a nerd who was Esperanto. So good catch.
Awesome. Well, with that, thank you so much again to you, Bim, for just an incredible, interactive, impactful presentation.
Yeah,
Shout
no
out
problem.
to,
Thanks for having me.
Anytime. Shout out and thank you to Tiled for being an amazing sponsor and providing this fancy webinar. And of course, to each and every one of you who joined live. We know that you have the option of watching the recording after the fact. We appreciate you tuning in. We know it hits a little different. And to everyone watching on the playback, we love you too. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording, and